Forget everything you think you know about what came out of that summit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, because what was reported, the smiling handshakes, the trade language, the carefully calibrated joint statements, was not the story. What was agreed, what was offered, and what was quietly buried before any journalist in Washington or Brussels could get near it, that is the story. And by the time I walk you through what actually happened in that room, you are going to understand exactly why the people running American foreign policy are hoping this particular conversation never gets traction. Let me be precise about what we are dealing with here. Xi Jinping did not travel to that table as a supplicant. He did not arrive as a partner in distress. He arrived as the leader of a nation that holds leverage over three of the five most consequential variables in this war: Ukrainian energy survival, Russian export income, and European strategic patience. And he knew it. Every serious intelligence analyst watching that summit knew it. And what China placed on the table was not a vague expression of goodwill toward a peace process. It was a condition, one condition, specific, structural, non-negotiable in its architecture. That condition was the removal of U.S. forward military posture from Taiwan's adjacent strategic perimeter, not a timeline, not a discussion framework, not a working group to study de-escalation modalities in the Taiwan Strait, a concrete, verifiable reduction in the U.S. military footprint that Beijing calculates as an existential encirclement threat. The same way, having spent decades analyzing how great powers read their own strategic environment, that Moscow read NATO's eastward march for 30 years before February 2022. That is not a rumor. That is not Chinese propaganda. That is what was put on the table. And here is the part that nobody in the mainstream press published. Not because they didn't know, but because the implications are so structurally destabilizing to the entire narrative architecture that Washington has built around both the Ukraine war and Taiwan simultaneously, that to publish it clearly would require them to answer a question they are not prepared to answer. What did the United States give China in exchange for precisely nothing on that condition? Let me take that in order, because the answer is staggering. What Xi received documented, confirmed in the economic annexes that were published and then rapidly buried under trade war headline fatigue, was this: a commitment on 200 Boeing commercial aircraft, a resumption of structured U.S. soybean purchase agreements running into the tens of billions, LNG supply commitments that give China a guaranteed American energy supply corridor independent of Middle Eastern volatility. These are not symbolic gestures. These are structural economic transfers that strengthen China's domestic political position, reduce Beijing's energy vulnerability, and insulate Xi from the kind of economic pressure that was the entire predicate of the American strategic approach to China for the last 4 years. In my time as a weapons inspector operating inside multilateral negotiation frameworks, I analyzed dozens of diplomatic exchanges where one party believed they were extracting concessions while the other party walked away with the machinery. This is that. This is the textbook version of that. Not a symbolic communique, not a photo opportunity, not a confidence-building measure with a review clause. The United States transferred material economic value, real, quantifiable, compounding economic value, to the People's Republic of China, and received in return no binding structural commitment on Iran, zero movement on Taiwan posture discussions, and a Chinese willingness to use influence on the Ukraine conflict that is worth exactly as much as every previous expression of Chinese willingness to use influence on the Ukraine conflict, which is to say nothing that any serious analyst would stake a ceasefire timeline on. Sit with that. You think you've heard the worst of it? You haven't. Not even close. Because here is the second dimension of this that is structurally more damaging than the transactional failure. The condition Xi placed on meaningful peace engagement, the Taiwan perimeter condition, was not rejected. It was not countered. It was not placed into a working framework for future negotiation. It was received, acknowledged in the diplomatic record, and then never responded to. The American side walked out of that summit having given China its Boeing contracts, its soybeans, its LNG corridor, and having said nothing on the record, about the one thing Beijing actually wanted. And here's what nobody in Washington will say out loud: that silence is itself a strategic signal. When a great power puts a condition on the table, and the other great power declines to answer it but accepts the accompanying economic package, what has just been established is a price list. China now knows with precision what the United States is willing to pay for the appearance of engagement. And it knows that the one thing it actually values, the restructuring of the strategic environment around Taiwan, remains untouched, unmoved, and most critically uncontested in any way that creates binding obligation. The escalation ladder just got longer on the Taiwan side and no shorter on the Ukraine side. That is the strategic outcome of this summit. That is what the Boeing jets bought. Now let me pull this out to the global chessboard, because the downstream consequences are already running. Russia watched this summit with the kind of cold, calculating attention that Moscow's strategic planners have been applying to U.S.-China relations for 3 years. What the Kremlin saw was confirmation of something Russian strategic doctrine has been gaming for a long time, that American diplomatic bandwidth is finite, that Washington cannot manage simultaneous great power competition at the level required, and that economic incentives offered to China in the context of Ukraine do not extract Chinese pressure on Russian behavior. Moscow continues its military campaign with the knowledge that the one outside actor with genuine economic leverage over Russian behavior, China, through its purchase of Russian hydrocarbons and its export of dual-use components, has just been rewarded for doing nothing. The deterrence architecture just took structural damage. Europe is watching something different. European capitals, particularly Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw, are processing what this summit signals about American strategic reliability in a way that is not being transmitted through the mainstream media filter with any accuracy. The question being asked in those capitals is not whether Washington got a good deal. The question is whether Washington understood what game was being played. Because if the United States genuinely believed it could trade soybean agreements for Chinese mediation leverage in a war that Beijing has carefully calibrated to neither win nor end, then the strategic miscalculation is not a negotiating failure, it is an analytical failure. And analytical failures of that magnitude do not get corrected in the next summit. They get corrected by events. And then there is Iran. The original predicate of the American engagement with China on Ukraine, the strategic scaffolding that justified the summit's framing as a peace-adjacent initiative, was the extraction of a Chinese commitment to pressure Iran to cease its provision of military material to Russia. Drones, ballistic missile components, the supply chain that has materially sustained Russian strike capacity against Ukrainian infrastructure through 2 winters. What Trump announced on Fox News was this. She said China would not give Iran military equipment. Trump called it a big statement. And in isolation, perhaps it sounds like one, but here's what that statement does not cover, and what the mainstream media has almost entirely failed to explain. It does not address the tens of billions of dollars in Iranian oil that Chinese refineries, the so-called teapot refiners, purchase every month in direct defiance of U.S. sanctions, providing Tehran with the economic oxygen that funds its entire war machine. It does not address the dual-use electronics and components flowing through Chinese intermediaries into Russian and Iranian military supply chains. And here's the detail that every serious analyst has to sit with. Xi's pledge appears nowhere in the Chinese government's own readout of the meeting. Beijing's foreign ministry confirmed no such commitment. The Chinese Ministry of National Defense, asked directly whether China had supplied Iran with military equipment, responded only that it opposes the spread of false information. That is not a commitment, that is a deflection. And China, having received its Boeing aircraft and its soybeans and its LNG corridor, now has precisely zero structural incentive to move any further. Any serious military analyst has to acknowledge what that means for the trajectory of this war. Ukraine is now entering its 4th year of industrial-scale attrition against a Russian force that is being sustained, in part, by Iranian munitions flowing through a supply chain that the one country with genuine leverage over that supply chain has just been economically rewarded for leaving intact. The diplomatic architecture that was supposed to constrain that supply chain produced instead a commercial aviation deal. That is the transaction. Those are the terms. That is what happened. The condition Xi put on meaningful engagement with the peace process was real, structural, and strategically coherent from Beijing's perspective. It asked the United States to make a tangible, verifiable concession on the issue that China has identified as its primary security concern. The United States declined to engage with that condition, offered economic concessions instead, and the summit was declared a success. What was not declared, what nobody published, is whether the war is any closer to ending. The answer, based on everything that was exchanged and everything that was withheld, is that it is not. The Taiwan condition remains on the table unanswered. The economic transfers are complete. The Iranian pledge sits unconfirmed in Beijing's own diplomatic record. While Chinese refineries continue buying Iranian crude and Chinese intermediaries continue feeding the supply chains that sustain this war. And somewhere in Beijing, in a room that no summit communique will ever describe, the strategic calculus for the next engagement has already been written. The question is not whether China will be asked again to help end this war. The question is what the asking will cost next time, and whether Washington will understand before it writes another check What it is and is not actually buy. Remember that.